And then there's the big one, the big technological innovation that is partially, not exclusively, related to storing. And it's also generally connected to sedentism here, ceramics. Ceramics are the Neolithic Ziploc bag and the archaeologist's best friend. So a little digression here into the wonderful world of ceramics and why they are so great. Ceramics are probably the most abundant artifact found in archaeology. You could find things that are ecofacts more often. I've done projects where we have 10,000 artifacts and 7,500 of them were little bits of unmodified shell. But a good 1,000 of them, so a very large percentage of what's left, would have been ceramics. Ceramics is the more technical term for what a lot of people will call pottery, right? Pottery refers to vessels that are made of ceramic, not necessarily all fired clay. Ceramic is the bigger term. Ceramics are where you take clay and you put it in a fire and heat it really hot, and it undergoes a chemical transformation, and effectively it becomes like stone. This is a one-way process, we'll talk about in a second, but it is an incredibly useful and versatile thing to be able to do. Now, remember the first things that people used ceramics for, the very first fired clay, we actually have already talked about in this class, and it was dating to 25,000 odd years ago, right? At Dolní Věstonice, we found these fired clay Venus figurines, right, and other figurines at that time, right? People understood that if you take certain kinds of dirt, right, that's recognizably different if you spend a lot of time staring at dirt, this very fine grain stuff called clay, and you put it in a fire. At the end of the fire, out of the ashes, you can pick it up and it will be stuck in the shape that you had it in permanently. So people sort of understood that for a long time. But it's not until now, about 10, 12,000 years ago, that we start getting ceramics made into pots, pottery, and used in a lot of different ways. I want to mention 4 reasons why archaeologists love ceramics, and one of them is this idea that you have plasticity is the term I'll use. It's on the next slide. I'll show it to you. The fact that it can be made into just about anything. Plasticity for archaeologists means that you can look at change over time. So we've got here this is from the 7th century BC. It's a Greek picture from the island of Rhodes. This is a medieval picture, let's see, from Bordeaux, 13th century. You're not actually going to have to know the specific locations for these things. This is something that looks a lot like a lot of the things that I actually deal with as a historical archaeologist. It's from the 18th century. It's made by a company called Wedgwood, originally by a guy named Wedgwood. Wedgwood still survives as a potting company. Some people may have things that look like this on their mantelpiece. Probably they are not 300 years old, though this particular style called Jasperware has been made for about 200 years, 250 years, so it might be, you never know. So a picture like that, and then this, I think I borrowed this from the IKEA website, right? So you're still getting ceramic pots that are set up basically the way they have been for the last 2,000 or 3,000 years. But are these all pretty much the exact same thing? No, right? It is a relatively easy thing to recognize the differences between them. And I imagine that, if you knew nothing about ceramics and I gave you pictures of these 4 and I asked you to put them in order from oldest to newest, you'd probably be able to do it pretty effectively, right? We have things that sort of are very different in terms of change over time. We also have differences in terms of style or formality, right? This is a fancy thing. The person who has this on their table has probably got some money and some other useful things there. This is a lot more basic, right? It's a lot more simple. It's a lot less pretty looking. This is pretty fancy looking. This is somewhere in between, right? It's a little more basic. No decorations, just red and shiny. So because clay is so plastic, people do all sorts of weird different things with it. And that means archaeologists can really get a real chronological sense out of them. They are great markers of time. Even if you don't have a date on one of these things, you can often tell what's older and what's newer because you've got this change over time. And as you become familiar with the sequence of pottery changes in your particular area, in your particular time period, you can really quickly glance at one and very quickly tell pretty much how old it is just by a quick read. So that's plasticity. The useful, archaeologists love ceramics because they are plastic, right? They are shapeable in any way you want. But anyone here will ever confess to perhaps breaking a dinner plate and getting yelled at by mom or dad or husband or wife? For a while, my wife and I would keep score from when we started living together until I think she just gave up on me. We decided that I think she broke 2.5 plates, and I broke 36.5 plates. Yeah. Well, I'm giving her half the blame because it was in an exchange. I was handing it to her. And we were washing dishes, so she should have known it was soapy. I'm just creating more information for the archaeologists of the future. That's my story. So, because of people who are really bad at not breaking things like me, we actually have exactly that. We have a really good sample of these things archaeologically. You can mold clay into anything, but once it's molded and once it's been fired, it's effectively it's stone, and you can't do much else with it. So if you break it, you can't fix that, right? We can glue some things together. If it's a display piece, that's okay. You can still see the lines, but it still looks okay. But I wouldn't want to eat off of that after you've put glue in it. And for the kinds of adhesives that are going to be available to pre-modern people, you're not going to be able to use it, right? You stick it together with pitch, but as soon as that gets wet, it's going to just come apart. So because it's fragile, it's going to break often in use, and it's going to then get replaced often. So if you imagine the sequence of things changing over time, I mean, this is a big, sharp distinction over 3,700 years here, or 2,700 years. But in between each of these plot points, in these different areas, there's lots of little subtle changes. A plate from the 1750s is different than the ones that they were using in the 1770s. And theirs are different than the ones they were using in the 1720s. And so even if you're going to have your grandma's set of china and you're never going to ever use it and you're just going to use it, keep it on the wall and try to keep it neat, I promise you, some butterfingered son-in-law is going to come in and accidentally destroy some of it, and you're not going to be able to do anything except pitch it out the window and get new ones. And so we have this, it's a regular part of life, but it's always sort of being replaced, right? So it's going to create more markers in the archaeological record. Ubiquity. I'm using that just like it's used in any other context. What's the word ubiquitous mean?
Usable for a lot of things.
More specifically, ubiquity is everywhere. It's everywhereness, right? It's something that's everywhere in every different context. You use ceramics in all parts of life. Now, we don't so much because for the last 80 or 90 years, we've had these fancy things called plastics, which have different sets of properties, which are going to mess with the future archaeologists a little bit. But up until then, if you were going to wash your face, you would get out of bed in the morning and you would go to a ceramic bowl that was there with water that somebody filled the night before. You did it yourself, or one of the kids did it, or your servant did it if you had a servant. And you have a ceramic pitcher. You would pour water into the pitcher, into the bowl, and you would splash it on your face and dry yourself off. And if you tip it while you bump against it while you're turning to go away from it, that goes onto the floor. Everything breaks. You have to toss it out the window and get another one. You also use it for cooking. You also use it for storage. You also use it for milking the goats. You also use it for fancy things that you put up on your wall to impress your neighbors, right? Different pots for different purposes, but they are in almost every aspect of the night, of your life. Wake up in the middle of the night and have to visit the outhouse, except that it's a Michigan winter and it's negative 24 degrees and there's 4 feet of snow going on out there. What do? No snowshoes. Pull out the chamber pot, right? Little pot, about that big on the top, about that big. Slides that are sort of rounded like this so things don't splash out too easily. Nice little solid handle. Everyone would have had one. Everyone would have used one. You wouldn't bother to go outside in unpleasant weather. You would have used your chamber pot. Stick it back under the bed until morning, until things calm down. So it's every part of life. And that means there's material culture associated with lots of these different parts of life, which are constantly being changed, constantly being replaced and constantly being used and tossed out the window when they break. It's also ubiquitous, so it's ubiquitous because you can form it into any shape, right? Because of that plasticity. You can make chamber pots or pans or plates or bowls or mugs or whatever you want. You can also have it everywhere because it's just incredibly cheap. On the whole, this is one of the cheapest things you've got in human history. You can just go out into this field and get some clay and make an open-fired thing in your own fireplace if you really want to. If you want something more useful that you can do more different things with, still, a kiln is not that difficult to create, and people have been able to do it in a lot of different places. You need wood or coal to burn, and you need clay and water. If you've got human beings living anywhere, you've probably got all those things already. So it's cheap, and it's easily made by pretty much anyone, and so easily made into lots of different things. I will mention, because of some of these other things, we've got an incredible preservation of in archaeological contexts for these things. So not only are they useful in every different aspect of life, but easily broken and something that everyone had or in many places and replaced regularly, they also, because they are chemically altered and effectively like stone once they've been fired, and you can't really do anything with a bunch of broken pieces of pot, they aren't going anywhere. You throw them out the window, I come by 4,000 years later, that pot is going to be there. It's going to look pretty much like it did the day you threw it out the window. It doesn't decompose, it doesn't rot, and until you get modern souvenir hunters looking to go pick up some things because they already know that they're old, no other human being is going to bother with them. If that golden, solid gold bowl that you have accidentally gets a crack in the side, and you're dumb enough to toss it out the window, somebody else is going to pick that thing up and do something with it, right? First of all, you could probably have fixed that crack, but second of all, someone else is going to reuse it. When your ceramic pot breaks, nothing to do with it. You can't fix it, you can't repair it, you can't put those pieces back together, and no natural processes are going to touch it. So it's going to be sitting there in the ground waiting for those future archaeologists to come by and collect it. You can't reuse it, it's not valuable like metal is, and it's not actually subject to decompositional processes. Some other examples of what ceramics look like in their earliest form. These are ceramics from the site at Natano in Japan. And Japan is actually a place that's really pretty wild about archaeology. There's a lot of great high-quality archaeology that's done in Japan. And one of the things that is has got the imagination of a lot of people in Japan is Jomon culture, which is the sort of earliest sort of recognized people had been in Japan, we think possibly before that, but Jomon is the sort of big occupation about 10,000 years ago. And it's when we start seeing pottery. Some of it is very simple, like this, and some of it is pretty complicated, like this decoration that has been made by forming the pot and then by applying little strings of clay to the outside. This is the earliest, sorry.
Sorry, I just had a quick question. That's not made to sit up, and so what would that be used for, storage?
Well, the thing is, it is made to sit up, and it would be used for storage. The thing we're not thinking about, and this is something that sort of boggled my mind for a long time. Even after I became an archaeologist, I would sort of think about, remember Greek amphoras, right? You ever watch one of those Discovery Channel specials, shows you a shipwreck with an amphora, these pointy pots that were used to store things. And I think to myself, why on earth do they make the ends so pointy? They can't stand them up. Except, remember that these nice flat surfaces we're dealing with are actually a pretty relatively recent occurrence in human history. More human history has been spent on irregular surfaces than on flat ones. And so on an irregular surface, a couple of stones, that will stand up just fine. On the sort of bumpy ground of a house floor or the edge of a hearth, that will stand up just fine. Good question, though. So Jomon, the Jomon culture in Japan about 10,000 years ago made the first things that we would call pots officially, right? They are containers made out of fired clay, made out of ceramic. We get that pottery in the Middle East about 8,000 BC, so about a little bit after. I suppose if you think the the ranges. Jomon is about 8 to 10,000 BC, and we get pottery in the Middle East about 8,000. It's pretty basic stuff. It's the kind of thing we could generally make by going into our backyard and finding some reasonably good clays and sticking them in, a barbecue pit or even just a fireplace. It doesn't have to be a very complicated process, although of course we get lots of much more complicated examples relatively quickly. As I mentioned before, there are other fired clays that are older than this. We have mud brick that may be left to dry, that may be partially fired for structures, and of course these figurines that are that sort of fascinate people. But remember, we're talking about the rise of agriculture, the beginning of food production, and with that comes sedentism. So this is sort of one of the technological results of sedentism. It's not practical to carry around a bunch of pots like this if you are a mobile hunter-gatherer, right? You are more likely to break it than to get it there in one piece, and you are it's going to be awful heavy when you get there. It's not really worth your time. You're probably going to make do with things like basketry, baskets that can be sometimes coated with clay if you need to keep it waterproof. Baskets can actually be made very nearly waterproof, pretty spectacular. Really good basket makers can weave really fine baskets that are almost waterproof. But those are going to be a lot more practical if you're a mobile hunter-gatherer. Pottery really only makes sense when you are sedentary, when you're not traveling around the landscape. Lots of different techniques that the earliest forms of pots were made with. Anyone here done any potting? A couple folks. How did you guys make your pots? This one, the coil method. Anyone use a wheel? Oh, a couple people use a wheel. Yeah, okay, a couple people. Our program's too cheap to have a wheel. Possibly so. Yeah, the earliest vessels were not certainly made with a wheel. A wheel was invented about 4000 BCE, I think. The first methods of making a container are going to be things that sort of, we all sort of figure out, or many of us will figure out if we are playing with Play-Doh now. You want to make a pot, you can make your little snakes, as my son calls them, coil them up like this, and then you smooth it up, and it makes it, it fills up those little spots in between. You can also make it, this is a little video of what's called the coil and anvil, the hammer and anvil method. They've got a big round flat stone inside and a little wooden stick that sometimes has a weight on it, and you sort of smack it on the side. And that actually seems like it would be a strange thing, but what it does is it kind of draws the clay up, and it also consolidates the clay. And you can use that to get really remarkably thin and light vessels. I mean, you sort of look at that. That's really going to be, when this potter's done, a pretty delicate vessel. So people sort of were aware of this process relatively early on in this period, but they weren't doing it largely because they weren't sedentary. They weren't agriculturalists, and so the carrying capacity of the land, food producers, they weren't farmers. The carrying capacity of the land wasn't enough to stay in one place. Here's the wheel, about 4000 BCE, and it really begins the process of having standardization in size, standardization in shape, the sort of proto-industrial production of pottery. Probably until then, the first couple of 4,000 years of pottery being made wherever it was made, it was something that was made very, very locally. An individual household would find a need for some and make it. Maybe one person in the village would be better at it than a few others, and so there would be a little bit of trading going on. But it's not until a bit later that we have sort of specialist potters, and that's something that we'll talk about in a sec.